Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi, and for today's video I'm going to be bringing you my reading wrap-up for autumn 2020. If you've been following my channel for a little while, then you know that I like to do this sort of quarterly reading wrap-up sort of thing, and that I don't follow traditional seasonal cutoff points. So when I say autumn 2020, I'm talking about September, October, and November of 2020. Considering I didn't read all too many books during those months, I doubt that this video will be crazy long, but my reading wrap-ups tend to be a little on the longer side of things, so it's best, I think, if we just get started. The first book that I read in the month of September was Cosmo Nights by Hannah Templer. This graphic novel follows a young woman named Pan who spends her days basically working at her dad's auto body shop and hanging out with her best friend slash kind of crush, a girl named. Things seem to be going well for them until Tara, who is a princess in this world, mysteriously disappears from their planet, and Pan is left alone wondering where her friend was taken. Her assumption, of course, is that Tara, being a princess, was given off as a prize to the winner of one of these off-world gladiator fights, where strapping young folks in Iron Man suits basically duke it out on behalf of some other people so that those people can then win a princess's hand in marriage and gain a lot of political and financial power. But when a pair of these gladiators shows up on Pan's doorstep, bleeding and wounded and in a whole lot of trouble, Pan discovers some deeply uncomfortable secrets about this neo-medieval world that she lives in and begins to toy with the idea of possibly burning it all down to protect herself and Tara wherever she may be. So in addition to having just the most stunning graphic novel art that I've seen in a very long time, Cosmo Nights covers some buzzwords that for me basically made it an insta-read. One, queers in space. It's just so full of sapphic ladies, trans characters. The representation is beautiful in its own voices. The fact that it's queer people existing in space makes it that much better. Two, neo-medieval sci-fi. I love when we put neo-medieval trappings on top of space tech. I just think it's the coolest thing. The aesthetic of the medieval period, pretty rad. Also though, the medieval period was a deeply patriarchal time, so the themes inherent of basically crushing the patriarchy, which is sort of a staple in all of these neo-medieval sci-fis that I've read at least, is something that I'm particularly drawn to. As far as things I liked, I really enjoyed exploring more of this world through Pan's eyes. She's lived a relatively closed-in and sheltered life, so getting to follow her as she discovered these brand new things sort of gave me as the reader the opportunity to have that same wide-eyed wonder while looking at this new world. And as far as things I didn't like, this is an issue I frequently have with graphic novels and comics and other primarily visual forms of readable media. The story never quite feels done, even if it says volume 1, so you assume, okay, this is a relatively complete portion of the greater story at large. Even that particular portion feels like it ends on a cliffhanger of sorts. These sorts of things can't stand on their own, and I prefer my stories, at least if I'm reading them in one go, to more or less stand for themselves. Though in the case of Cosmo Nights, I enjoyed it enough that I'm definitely going to be picking up volume 2. So maybe this is just a really clever marketing ploy. After Cosmo Nights, I read The Deal by Elle Kennedy. This is the first of her off-campus hockey college romance series. It follows Hannah Wells, a college junior who's pretty much good at everything. Doesn't have too many friends, but isn't too bothered about that, has a job, etc. Everything's going well, except for her basically non-existent dating life. Due to trauma caused by a rape that she experienced earlier in her life, Hannah does not really have confidence when it comes to sex or dating or interacting with guys, but her burgeoning crush on a football-playing jock leads her to want to change this status about herself. She no longer wants to be a sort of invisible wallflower. She wants to be seen as attractive. On the other hand, we have Garrett Graham, captain of the hockey team and terrible at writing essays for a philosophy class where Hannah is the only student basically doing a good job. Garrett is everything that Hannah hates about sports boys. He's cocky, he's arrogant, he thinks he can get any girl he wants. So when Garrett approaches Hannah asking her to help him with philosophy so that he doesn't basically get put on academic probation and lose his ability to play hockey for his winning team, only thing that makes her say yes is the proposal of a deal wherein she will school him on philosophy and he will school her and sort of fake date her in order to make the guy she actually wants jealous. But their tutoring sessions get a little steamy and romance ensues, and it's really cute. As far as things I liked about The Deal, it was such a pacey, easy read. I'm always a fan of romances where the two protagonists don't really like each other too much at first, when they think that they have conflicting interests, etc., and that they realize that they have more things in common as the time they spend together progresses and as they move forward. Garrett and Hannah, I think, are really good complements to one another. They're both incredibly stubborn but determined people, and I think that feeds in a really healthy and positive way within their relationship. Additionally, the way that the story and their relationship progressed vis-a-vis taking care of one another emotionally through their various traumas trigger warning for mentions of rape and trigger warning for mentions of child abuse specifically, was I think very thoughtfully and well done. As far as things I didn't like, and it's a problem that I've noticed is not uncommon in het romances that I've read. Towards the end of the story, after some friction occurs in their relationship, to keep it spoiler free, Garrett is pushy and pushes some boundaries that I was not comfortable reading about. I know it was meant to be like sexy and like cute of him to be doing these things, but I just found it really icky and kind of misogynist that he was doing these things. It was very much a paternalistic, oh, I know better than you, so just let me have my way sort of thing. Didn't like that. Didn't like it at all. It is a romance, so I know that the happily ever after like has to happen. It's a genre staple, but I feel like there could have been a better way to sort of have that happen at the end without Garrett being so like creepily pushy. Following it up with another very sweet story that includes a very sweet romance, but in a very different way, I read You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. This story follows Liz Leidy, basically the only Black girl at Campbell High School. Liz is a bit of a wallflower. She doesn't really stand out or make much of a fuss. She's predominantly focused with making sure that she can get a scholarship to go to a college. And one thing she really doesn't give much thought to, just because her prospects for romance don't really seem very high, and also it's just not of interest to her, is the prom, which is sort of the obsession of everyone else in her vicinity, not just her high school, but like her town. But when her prospects for financial aid, which was the only way she was going to be able to go to this college, fall short, Liz is devastated until she remembers that if she wins prom queen, she gets a scholarship, one that will more than cover her tuition to go to this school. Prom and everything that goes along with it is a lot more than she bargained for, and the only thing that gets her through is a new girl who's also in the running to be prom queen, a girl named Mac who seems to march to the beat of her own drum, and is sort of marching her way straight into Liz's heart. What can I say about this book, except for the fact that had I read it as a sapphic high schooler who was having difficulty coming to terms with her own queerness, growing up in the state of North Carolina in a very, very small town, I probably would have hated myself a lot less. I absolutely adored You Should See Me in a Crown. Liz was a beautiful protagonist to follow. She has such a good head on her shoulders and is not afraid to dream big with her ambitions and then actually go forward and make those happen. Her friend group is so supportive of her dreams and is doing just absolutely everything within their power to make sure that her ability to win this thing happens, despite the racism and the homophobia that she faces along the way. On top of that, something I forgot how much I adored until I read this book, the family dynamics between Liz and the rest of the Leidies just warmed my whole heart. Part of the reason that Liz wants to go to college to become a doctor is because her brother has sickle cell anemia, and she's watched him struggle with that his whole life, and she wants to be a doctor that specifically serves the African American community who tends to have more issues with sickle cell specifically. It all connects. Every thread of the story connects into a beautiful, cohesive, happy story, which is surprisingly short for how much of a punch it packs. I can't say that there's any part of You Should See Me in a Crown that I didn't like. Were I being a real butthead, I might say, oh, is it really possible for a small town to be that obsessed with prom? I grew up in a small town though, and yes, the answer is yes. The way that folks from small towns draw so much of their identity from these weird niche things is unparalleled anywhere else. So no, it's not that crazy. I can't wait to reread this over and over again whenever I'm in the need for a pick-me-up. Following that, I read The Princess Beard by Delilah Dawson in conjunction with Kevin Hearn. The Princess Beard is the third and final book in the Tales of Pell trilogy of companion novels by this co-author duo. It starts off very Sleeping Beauty waking up from her curse, and instead of being, beautiful and kissed and ready to be awoken by a prince, she has these gnarly, super long nails and a beard, and she's very unkempt, and it's very clear that she's been unconscious for several months. And she decides that the only way to escape the expectations placed upon her by not only her family, but by the princess trope in general, is to leave. So she changes her name and finds her way aboard a big pirate ship alongside a super swole centaur with hyper-fragile masculinity who has tea and cupcake magic, a dryad who hopes to pass the bar exam and become a lawyer, and an elf who is remarkably bad at being an elf, so he's like the opposite of Legolas and more like a little Keebler boy. And the four of them and these pirates sail away on a fantastical adventure to find out exactly what is in this mystery meat from this restaurant chain called Dinny's, that's causing people to go so crazy, but is actually really heinous and suspect. The plot of this one is really hard to actually explain because so much is happening and there's not really like a central main character. But the point is, this is basically just like fantasy parody. The entirety of the Tales of Pell trilogy is sort of in this vein. As far as things I like, I could tell that Delilah Dawson and Kevin Hearn were definitely in the know about the fantasy genre in a way that's similar to like the Harry Potter musical. They poke at things in the genre and say, okay, this is patently ridiculous that this thing happens all the time, so we're just gonna take it and make you look at it, and we're gonna make it even more ludicrous for this reason. I particularly liked the character Vic, who is the super swole misogynist centaur, because I felt that his character arc of going from like this super fragilely masculine young man horse, from the super fragilely masculine centaur, he grew into a more respectful person who was more okay with himself. He came to accept that his hyper feminine magic was actually really cool and could be used in service of his friends. As far as things that, you know, rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, like I mentioned before, the story didn't really have much in the way of cohesion. We weren't following one specific main character, which is fine normally. However, I don't think we followed any of the characters previously mentioned closely enough for the story to sort of have one overarching arc that we were following overall. And I can't even say that it was plot-based because the plot meandered in so many different directions for the sake of goofs, it seemed like. And don't get me wrong, some of the goofs were pretty great. Some of them, though, were just like not my favorite. It definitely put plot and character to the side in order to like attempt to be funny. And I feel like occasionally it felt a little bit like it was forcing the humor, which I just wanted more story, you know? I wanted a little bit more character development, etc. Which isn't to say that there wasn't any. It was just, you had to look for it. It was a little bit harder to come by. And it didn't always feel earned because it sort of felt rushed through because so much previous page time was spent, you know, doing jokes. But I definitely had fun with it. It kept me entertained from the first page to the last. So, I mean, what more can you hope for in a book? And the final book that I read in September was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This was a reread for me. And the first two books that I read in the following month were the rest of the Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy. This story follows Feyre Archeron, a human woman from the land of Prythian, the majority of which is conquered and ruled by the Fae. And this first story basically follows a Beauty and the Beast arc where Feyre is a huntress and a sort of bloodthirsty beauty who is taken by Tamlin the Beast, not because her father makes a bad deal, but because she kills a Fae creature that wandered over into the mortal lands in the guise of a wolf in order to keep to the human-Fae alliance. Feyre owes Tamlin her life, and so she goes and is whisked away into the Fae lands, and a lot of shenanigans happen from there. And honestly, this story has been talked about so often on BookTube that I don't really feel like it's a spoiler to say that the following two books follow Feyre after she is turned into one of the High Fae at the end of this story, after she manages to break the beast curse on Tamlin and his court. And from there, she and her High Fae mate have to create an alliance to fight a war against the King of Hybern, a different Fae king who is kind of a huge jerk and wants to re-subjugate the humans and mortals and turn them back into Fae slaves as they were before the agreement on Prythian was made. This series is what I like to call romantic pseudo-fantasy, where the predominant story really is romance. That's what we're here for. That's what is sort of the hook and cornerstone of this series. But it's got so many fantastical trappings, and in the later books especially, there's a lot more stuff that we associate with high fantasy, like war and interesting fairy creatures, etc. But like anyone who reads it will tell you, we're here predominantly for the romance. And as far as things I like about the story, I will say that Feyre's character growth is pretty good. She develops in strength and ability far faster than just about anyone would be able to. But I feel like that's to be expected in a romance story with fantastical backdroppings, especially. Like, of course she is. She's gonna be, like, if she can't be the lost princess or whatever, she's gonna be like the hyper magical, super good at everything, like High Fae queen. But I was drawn to Feyre most when she was having her more human moments, when she was suffering from and recovering from the trauma that she goes through in her childhood and in this story, via anger at first and eventually love and companionship. I really enjoy her determination and her desire to keep people safe, because at the end of the day, no matter how she started, she does value life and she does value peace. As far as things I don't like, let's move past the sort of clumsy attempt at introducing diversity from the LGBT plus community, as well as people of color in the last book. The propensity for info dumping, and like I said earlier, the super OP-ness of our main characters. The thing I really want to focus on as something I didn't like happened in the third book, A Court of Wings and Ruin. I didn't have to memorize it, I could have just looked back and checked. I did not love the differences between the way that the female villains and the male villains were handled in the end. Without fail, male villains were given the opportunity for redemption, no matter how hideous their previous crimes were, whereas female villains, no matter how hideous their crimes were punished in truly sickening, gruesome ways. Like, even more so than the big bad at the very end, he got to die a quick and relatively clean death, whereas one of the lady villains toward the end had a drawn out, torturous death. It just rubbed me the wrong way that the ladies who did bad things were vilified and punished horrifically for it, whereas the men who did comparable things were just given a slap on the wrist. Didn't love that. Don't love it. It smacks, it absolutely reeks of Not Like Other Girls to me, or of the same feelings that cause Not Like Other Girls feelings in certain people. Overall though, because I knew it was all coming, having read the series once before, I knew what I was going into expecting it, and really I just needed something light that would get me through, and these are very easy stories to get through, so I can't say I didn't enjoy it. Plus, now I'm all caught up and it's a little fresher in my mind for Nesta's story, Nesta being my favorite character, and I'm very excited for A Court of Silver Flames when we get to figure out what's going to happen to her. Following that, I finished the first season of a webtoon. Webtoons are a thing I got into in 2020 and have continued to enjoy into 2021. I know that we're not even a full month in, but it's definitely something that I am at present currently enjoying. And I read Castle Swimmer Volume 1. This is written and drawn by Wendy Leanne Martin. Castle Swimmer follows Kappa, a young golden-scaled mermaid. He is what's known as the Beacon. And that is a special mermaid who is connected to all of these various mermaid factions and clans, as he's basically the linchpin of the prophecies that, once fulfilled, will allow these mermaid clans to thrive and prosper. Kappa learns from a very young age that people don't really always love the way that he fulfills their prophecies, and he also finds out pretty quickly on that once he has fulfilled his use with these mermaid colonies, folks aren't all that keen on keeping him there, and that's okay because the prophecies pull him to other places as well. But because of this, he grows up fairly isolated and not really feeling like he ever has a place, because the people that interact with him only do so because they have something to gain from him. That is until he wanders into a clan of mermaids that are sort of modeled off of sharks. This clan of mermaids is sort of ostracized by the others because they are cursed to be scarred up. If they can get injured, they will get injured. And their prophecy and the meaning of it is a very dire thing. However, their prophecy is a pretty gruesome one. The shark people believe that their unscarred prince must kill the Beacon, spill all of his blood, kill him absolutely dead in order for their curse to break and for their people to begin to heal and move forward. Siren, this unscarred prince, has known that he is going to be his people's savior. They keep him away from hunts and things so that there's no chance in heck a scar could appear on his body, so that the prophecy basically becomes null and void and they have to wait for another prince to potentially take up the mantle. They all love him so dearly because he represents their salvation, but he is terrified and deeply unwilling to kill. And he thinks he can do it until he finds the Beacon locked up in his mom's dungeon, basically. And he sees that this person isn't just here to fulfill his prophecy. This is an afraid young man, just like him, who does not want to die. And instead of killing him, the two begin a tenuous friendship, and eventually fall in love. And the story moves forward from there, but it's so cute. I'll preface this by saying there's not really anything I don't like about the story, except for maybe that because it's a webtoon, I only get like one chapter a week, and they're all relatively short, so I'm constantly left wanting more. It's a very serialized sort of thing. But as far as things I like, what to focus on. First, the art style. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Wendy Leanne Martin is an incredible artist. I love the vibrancy of the colors she uses. The design for her mermaid creatures is just really cool. Each sort is sort of modeled off of a deep sea creature. They're not all, fish tails and like human torsos. Some have like peacock mantis shrimp bodies. Some are like octopus shaped. It reminded me a little bit of the aesthetic and design choices of the TV show She-Ra, because of just the vibrancy of the color and the whimsicality of the world around them. Part 2, for such a potentially angsty story, is a deeply funny and heartfelt and sweet story as well. There are definitely the darker moments, but I feel like they're very well balanced out by cute, fluffy, happy goodness. I'll leave a link to where you can read Castle Swimmer down below for free. So if you want to read about two young men falling in love despite all the odds, and you want to read a fantasy story that'll keep you absolutely gripped from panel to panel, I definitely recommend you check that one out. My next read in October was The Cabinet of Curiosity, 36 Tales, Brief and Sinister by bunch of authors, Stephen Bachman, Catherine Catmull, Claire Legrand, and Emma Trevane. This is a collection of short stories that are a little bit middle grade, a little bit spooky, and definitely right up my alley. It was a perfect October read. The sort of concept of this book is that each of the authors are curators for this Cabinet of Curiosities, a museum of interesting things and adventures, some sinister, lurking around every corner. And they bring back these objects, but more importantly than these objects that these curators bring back from their travels, they bring back the stories related to these creepy objects, and each story sort of follows one of those. I've read Claire Legrand books before and thoroughly enjoyed them, and I think that all four of these authors, while they each have very distinctive writing styles and prose styles, I enjoyed all of them tremendously. I didn't have one that stood as a favorite over the other. So while they were all different, I think they blended very well. And I think the flow of the stories made a tremendous amount of sense. Of course, there were some stories that I preferred to some of the others, but overall, most of them were of like a pretty solid quality. There are definitely stories that I would like to come back to, which isn't always the case for me when I read anthologies or story collections. And the stories are such that if you're a particularly precocious middle grade reader, I don't think you'll have any trouble at all. Like, they're spooky, but they're not to the point of like you can't sleep at night spooky. Basically, I had a whole lot of fun reading the story. I'd super recommend it. And the following thing that I read in the month of October was the close of a series that I've been buddy reading with several of my friends, and that is The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. Every time I speak about the Lord of the Rings at all on this channel, I feel kind of silly giving any sort of synopsis, because at this point, it's like as classic as a fantasy story can be. I don't even know how to describe it just because it is so foundational, but in case you need the briefest and worst of synopses as a refresher for what the story is basically about, it is the close of the story where Frodo takes the weight of this one ring and finally gets that sucker into that mountain where it belongs, tossed into the lava to be destroyed and for the Dark Lord to be defeated once and for all, while the rest of his company fights a war to distract the Dark Lord so Frodo can finally do his thing. Terrible. Never gonna ever use that specific synopsis ever again. But the point is, well, for starters, I think I should say that there's nothing I don't like about the story. Not only is it foundational fantasy, it's also foundational for me. I love Tolkien. I love The Lord of the Rings. It is one of the stories that I consider like a cornerstone of my fantasy-loving heart. But as far as things I like, on this read in particular, I read it exactly when I needed to read it. 2020 was a difficult year, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the blatant racism and homophobia and just general xenophobia stoked by our former commander-in-chief / president, Donald Trump. And truly, if you are not American, you cannot know how sweet it is to put former before that list of titles. In a time when things were turbulent, to say the least, a story where I was comfortable in the knowledge that things would be all right in the end, that evil would fail because evil has to fail, was such a comfort. And at times, these characters, much like me myself, experienced a complete sense of hopelessness and inability to believe that anything would ever be good again. And yet they still persevered. They did the right thing anyway, even when things felt futile. And it was just a really good reminder to keep going when keeping going was very hard. And I realize I've said nothing of substance about why I like the book specifically, but I think in this time around of reading it, what mattered less was the story itself and more was the experience that the reading gave to me. So thank you, J.R.R. Tolkien. Thank you, Return of the King, for giving that sense of comfort to me when I needed it most. And finally, we move on to the month of November, where I only read two things, but damn were they both good. The first story that I read in the month of November was Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, and oh my god. The story of Cemetery Boys follows a young man named Yadriel who was born into a family of brujes, or witches, if we're going to give a direct translation from Spanish to English, but it's a little bit more than that. These brujes are sort of the middleman between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And because Yadriel is a trans man, his family doesn't really believe in his ability to be a brujo. They believe that the gender he was assigned at birth will determine the way that his magic will show up, if it shows up at all. But Yadriel is determined to prove himself, not just to his family as a whole, but to his father especially, that he is a brujo. He is a man deserving of this legacy, a young man accepted by the Lady of Death to fulfill the responsibility of the brujos of his family. So he tries to complete his quinces ritual to bring the spirit of his murdered cousin Miguel back to tell him what happened, the circumstances around his murder, and then set his soul free into the afterlife. What he does instead is summon the ghost of the resident bad boy of his school, a young man named Julian, who has also been murdered but didn't really know it until Yadriel calls him. But Julian is not one to go gentle into that great night. He refuses to let Yadriel send his spirit free, and is instead determined to figure out what happened to him, not only what happened to him, but what might have happened to the rest of his sort of found family on the night that he went missing and died. And so Julian and Yadriel had to go on a journey and an adventure to figure out what happened to Julian and what's happening to other people going missing, with a pretty strict time limit, because the longer a spirit sticks around the mortal world, the more likely they are to go bad ghost and need to be banished permanently. But the longer Yadriel spends with Julian, the less he realizes that he actually wants the pretty but kind of mean, but also not that mean boy to actually go. So this is like quintessential like low fantasy / urban fantasy romance, and I love every gosh darn second of it. What is the queer experience really, if it's not imagining a ghost partner for yourself who loves you to the ends of the world and can fuck with other people on your behalf and takes you on a mystery to figure out what happened to them? No, not everyone. That was just my queer experience. Okay. I delighted in every second of Cemetery Boys. While the big twist in the plot was relatively easy to figure out, it in no way detracted from my enjoyment of figuring out exactly what happened to Julian and the uncovering of this super fast-paced mystery. And I have only good things to say about this romance between these two broken in very different ways young men who just love each other. They love each other, and it's so good and so cute how their relationship develops so quickly, but in such an organic feeling way that it didn't feel like insta-love. The last thing I sort of want to cover as a thing that I loved was the interpersonal dynamics between folks. I love a good, close family, even if the family is flawed. I loved Yadriel and his brujos. I loved every single one of them, even though they were being kind of butts to Yadriel, and it was obvious that systemic change needed to be made in their traditions in order to make room for people to, actually exist and be. And I loved how ride or die Julian is for his basically found family. I don't want to spoil things. I love this story. I really love this story. As far as the sort of cultural aspects of the story that are inherent when you're writing an own voices Latinx story, specifically one to do with Dia de los Muertos. I can't speak to those on a deeply personal level, and I encourage you to seek out Own Voices reviews for this story, which I'll have linked in the description box below. It was super refreshing to see those cultural elements brought in, not for the white gaze, if that makes sense. Like, it was very much like, okay, if you don't know what this is, look it up. Google's free. Ultimately, it didn't apologize for being a very Latina story. And I loved it. No complaints. Truly will pick up anything that Aidan Thomas writes. And the final book that I read in the month of November, and therefore fall of 2020. And when I say end of November, I mean literally last day of the month, was that I finished reading Royal Assassin Book 2 of the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hogg. Y'all. Anyway, this story follows the Assassin's Apprentice, where we meet Fitz Farseer, who is the bastard son of the former king-in-waiting Prince Chivalry, who later winds up dead. As is possibly indicated by the title of the first book, Fitz is conscripted to be the king's assassin, or the apprentice to the king's assassin, because that is really the only way that bastards of royalty continue to stay alive for very long. Assassin's Apprentice follows Fitz through his early childhood, through his very, very early teen years, whereas Royal Assassin follows his mid to late teen years as he is approaching young adulthood. In the earlier novel, Fitz was a deeply isolated and scared young boy just looking for family. In Royal Assassin, Fitz becomes a hot-headed and deeply angry at the abuse that he suffered young man who now has more strength and more power to do things about his loneliness and his being full of rage. In addition to raising the stakes from the first book by adding to the subterfuge and the bad things that are happening, I think the core of the story and the part of it that really spoke to me and that I think is my favorite part of the story was Fitz beginning to discover his place in this world. For a very long time, he sort of just does what he's told, more or less, with varying degrees of actual ability to listen. But I feel like in Royal Assassin, where Fitz sort of enters his adolescence with one hell of a bang, he begins to decide that maybe this isn't what he wants. Maybe he doesn't want to just be somebody who is a pawn on the board for larger players. Maybe he wants to have an identity of his own. Maybe he wants to have a life where he isn't beholden to the whims of a king, whoever that king may be. Maybe he wants to have a marriage and a family of his own that he can't be called away from. And while on one hand he really loves the king in waiting, Verity, his uncle, who forms a very close bond with him, and he wants to help him with his use of the skill and his growing strong body when going to fight against the raiders who are still plaguing the Six Duchies. Fitz is still remarkably isolated, and that causes him so much loneliness and pain and anger that eventually he just lashes out, even against those closest to him. There's nothing about the story that I don't like. I will say that it can be very difficult to read. Robin Hobb does not pull punches in the stories that she writes. She finds the ugliest thing that can happen in a situation. And in a situation where war is happening, there's a lot of very ugly things to look at, and she forces you to stare at it and not look away and say, this is what people are capable of. You decide whether you want to be better or not. I've heard some people say that it's like a shock factor thing, and I do not feel that that is the case. I feel like every word that she chooses is specific and intentional, and every plot point, therefore, and every scene that she writes has a purpose. And sometimes you don't know what that purpose is at the very end of a book. You have to wait until the end of the trilogy to get to it. And there's some things that I know that I'm going to have to read the entirety of the Realm of the Elderlings series for before everything comes together in one neat piece. Even a book as chunky as this one flies by so quickly. But after I finished Royal Assassin, I needed to get into the third book, because holy shit, the ending of this one took the wind out of me. Like, I could not breathe. I am officially trash for the Realm of the Elderlings saga. I will never be the same. I will never recover. And if that isn't like the most glowing recommendation that a book nerd can give to another book nerd, the fact that a story will consume you entirely and absolutely destroy your entire life, I don't know what is. And with that, I'm happy to close out this fall 2020 wrap up. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up. And if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to this channel. I post videos every weekend, and I would love to have you join my little bookish family. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned here today, please comment down below and let me know what you thought of them. I always love talking books with lovely bookish people. But until my next video, all my socials are in the description box below. You can find me on Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you with the next one very, very soon. Goodbye.